What if the history you were taught was a carefully crafted story, a tale designed to conceal some of the most monstrous acts ever committed in the name of God? We're raised to see institutions of faith as pillars of morality, as beacons of compassion. We're told stories of saints, martyrs, charity, and salvation, but beneath that pristine surface lies a history so brutal, so drenched in blood, and so defined by hypocrisy that it's been deliberately buried, fragmented, and forgotten. This isn't a story about faith. It's a story about power, the kind of power institutions wield and the horrific lengths they'll go to in order to keep it. It's about what happens when dogma becomes more valuable than human life, when blind obedience is demanded over critical thought, and when those in charge decide they are no longer accountable to the very morals they preach. For centuries, many of these stories were dismissed as biased, exaggerated, or just propaganda. But the evidence, carved into the stone of history and written in the blood of its victims, is undeniable. These weren't just isolated incidents. They were part of a chilling pattern of suppression, violence, and control, carried out by an institution that claimed to hold the keys to heaven, while often creating a living hell right here on Earth. In this video, we're pulling back the curtain. We're digging through the mass graves of history to uncover 5 cruel truths the Church desperately tried to hide. What you're about to hear isn't for the faint of heart. It will challenge what you think you know, and it will force you to ask some uncomfortable questions about power, belief, and the dark underbelly of human history. In the year 1209, a massive crusader army, blessed by the most powerful man in Europe, Pope Innocent III, stood before the fortified city of Béziers in southern France. Their mission wasn't to fight a foreign enemy, but to exterminate a group of fellow Christians, the Cathars, whose beliefs were labeled heretical. As the city's defenses started to crumble, the soldiers had a question. The city was a mix of Catholics and Cathars living side by side. How were they supposed to tell the faithful from the heretics? The papal legate, Abbot Arnaud Amalric, gave a reply that is echoed through the centuries as one of history's most chilling commands. Caedet eos, novit enim dominus qui sunt eos. Kill them all. God will know his own. While many historians doubt Amalric uttered these exact words, what happened next is not in dispute. The crusading army poured into the city and unleashed a hurricane of violence. They didn't distinguish between Catholic and Cathar, man or woman, adult or child. Those who sought refuge in the city's churches were slaughtered where they huddled, the sanctuary floors running red with their blood. In a letter to the Pope, Amalric himself boasted that his forces put to the sword nearly 20,000 people, a number modern historians believe is an exaggeration, though the true death toll was still in the thousands. The city of Béziers wasn't just conquered, it was erased. This act of methodical, unrestrained slaughter was not an anomaly. It was the opening act of our first cruel truth. The massacre at Béziers was just the beginning of a 2-decade campaign of terror known as the Albigensian Crusade, a holy war waged by Christians against Christians from 1209 to 1229. This wasn't a fight to reclaim some distant Holy Land. It was a brutal internal purge designed to wipe out a thriving Christian movement that challenged the authority and wealth of the Catholic Church. The Cathars, also known as the Albigensians, were centered in the Languedoc region of what is now southern France. Their faith was starkly different from Roman Catholicism. They were dualists who believed the material world was an evil creation, a prison for the soul. They rejected the Church's sacraments, its hierarchy of priests and bishops, and its massive accumulation of wealth. Their leaders, known as perfects, lived lives of poverty and nonviolence, which stood in stark contrast to the perceived corruption of the local Catholic clergy. This wasn't just a theological disagreement, it was a direct threat to the power of the medieval church and the French crown. Pope Innocent III saw Catharism as a cancer that had to be cut out. After his legate Pierre de Castelnau was murdered in 1208, an act he blamed on a Cathar-sympathizing count. Innocent III did something unprecedented. He declared a crusade inside Christendom itself. He offered the same remission of sins to those who fought the heretics in France as those fighting in the Holy Land, and, even more enticingly, offered the lands of heretical lords to any French nobleman willing to take up arms. It was a holy war, and a land grab rolled into one. Led by the ruthless Simon de Montfort, the crusade continued its bloody march. At the siege of Minerve in 1210, 140 Cathar perfects who refused to renounce their faith walked into a massive pyre and were burned alive. At Marmande, the population was massacred. While some early sources claim death tolls as high as 1 million, most modern historians believe these numbers are speculative. Still, the war was an act of extreme brutality over 2 decades, which systematically destroyed the unique culture of the Languedoc region. The crusade also laid the groundwork for one of the Church's most feared institutions, the Inquisition, established to root out any last traces of heresy. The Albigensian Crusade is a horrifying testament to the fact that, for the institutional church, the greatest enemy wasn't always a foreign threat, but any Christian who dared to imagine a different path to God. But the horrors didn't stop there. Our next truth takes us from a war against a community to the targeted destruction of a single, brilliant mind. A woman whose very existence was a threat. In the early 5th century, Alexandria, Egypt was the intellectual capital of the Roman world, and at the center of its academic life was a woman of towering intellect, Hypatia. Born around 355 CE, she was a philosopher, mathematician, and astronomer, a charismatic teacher who drew students from across the empire. She was a symbol of the classical world's commitment to reason and inquiry. But Hypatia lived in a city that was tearing itself apart. The old pagan traditions were being aggressively replaced by a newly empowered and often militant Christianity. In 412, a man named Cyril became the Bishop of Alexandria, determined to stamp out any threat to Christian dominance. Hypatia, a respected pagan intellectual, got caught in a bitter political feud between Cyril and the city's Roman prefect, Orestes. Orestes admired Hypatia and often sought her counsel, which infuriated Cyril and his supporters. They saw her as a wicked sorceress who was preventing the governor from reconciling with the bishop. She became the scapegoat for the political gridlock, a symbol of the pagan intellectualism that Cyril wanted to destroy. The hatred boiled over in March of 415. As Hypatia was traveling home, she was ambushed by a mob led by a church official named Peter. This mob, made up of fanatical monks associated with Cyril's faction, dragged the philosopher from her carriage and hauled her to a former pagan temple that had been converted into a Christian church. Inside, they committed an act of unimaginable barbarity. They stripped her naked, and as the 5th century historian Socrates Scholasticus recorded, murdered her using ostraca, sharp shards of pottery or roof tiles. Some accounts say they scraped the flesh from her bones while she was still alive, though historians debate the precise, grisly details. Her dismembered body was then dragged through the streets and burned. Hypatia's murder was a political assassination and an act of cultural annihilation. It sent a clear message: the age of classical reason was over, and the age of dogma had begun. The intellectual life of Alexandria began a long decline. While Cyril's direct order for the murder can't be proven, the crime was committed by his followers against his chief political rival's advisor. He was later made a saint, his legacy secured by the church, while Hypatia's story was largely suppressed. A terrifying example of the church silencing not just ideas, but the very people who championed them. This impulse to punish those deemed impure wouldn't end in the ancient world. Centuries later, it resurfaced in a modern and insidious form, targeting not philosophers, but tens of thousands of ordinary women. For most of the 20th century, Hidden behind high walls and a veneer of Catholic charity, a system of brutal incarceration and forced labor flourished across Ireland. From 1922 until 1996, thousands of girls and women were imprisoned in institutions known as the Magdalen Laundries, while the official 2013 Irish government inquiry, known as the Magdalene's Report, documented over 10,000 women. Many estimates place the total number as high as 30,000. These weren't prisons or asylums, they were workhouses run by religious orders, where inmates were stripped of their names and freedom, forced into grueling, unpaid labor. Who were these women? They were so-called fallen women, a chillingly broad category that could include unmarried mothers, victims of sexual assault, or even those just considered too rebellious or pretty for Ireland's conservative society. Some were sent by their families, others by priests or police. The Magdalene's report confirmed that the state was deeply involved, referring over a quarter of the documented cases. On entry, a woman's life was erased. Her name was changed, her hair cut short, and her clothes replaced with a drab uniform. Communication with the outside world was cut off. The work was relentless. 6 days a week, the women toiled in industrial laundries, washing clothes for paying customers that included government departments and businesses. The conditions were hellish: steam, caustic chemicals, and dangerous machinery. Survivors recall being forbidden to speak for long stretches of the day, with any rule breaking met with cruel punishments like solitary confinement or food deprivation. While the Magdalene's report highlighted psychological abuse, it found no evidence of regular physical or sexual abuse, a finding that many survivors and their advocates fiercely dispute. This system of what many have called religious-run slavery was an open secret, enabled by a quiet conspiracy of church, state, and society. The truth only began to surface in 1993, when a convent sold land and developers discovered a mass, unmarked grave of 155 women. This cracked open the wall of silence, leading to investigations and, in 2013, a formal state apology. A compensation fund was set up, but the religious orders that ran the laundries and profited from the women's labor have consistently refused to contribute. It's a horrifying chapter where, under the guise of charity, the church and state collaborated to operate a network of abusive workhouses, shattering thousands of lives. This model of using faith-based institutions for forced assimilation was not unique to Ireland. Across the Atlantic, a similar and even deadlier system was deployed against an entire population of children. From the 1880s until 1997, the Canadian government, in partnership with Christian churches, operated a network of mandatory boarding schools for Indigenous children. Over 150,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children were forcibly taken from their families and sent to these schools. The stated goal was assimilation. The reality, as one government official put it, was to get rid of the Indian problem by killing the Indian in the child. On arrival, children were plunged into an alien world. They were stripped of their clothes, their hair was cut, and they were forbidden, often under threat of severe beatings, from speaking their native languages or practicing their traditions. Siblings were separated. They were taught that their culture, their parents, and their entire way of life were savage and inferior. Life in the schools was a nightmare of neglect and abuse. They were underfunded, overcrowded, and rife with disease like tuberculosis. Malnutrition was rampant. The death rates were staggering. Children who died were often buried in unmarked graves on school grounds, their parents never notified, simply to save money. Beyond neglect, children endured horrific physical, emotional, and staff abuse from the priests, nuns, and staff. In 2015, Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, concluded its investigation after hearing from nearly 7,000 survivors. Its final report described the system as cultural genocide. It documented over 3,200 deaths, but noted the true number is likely far higher due to destroyed records. In recent years, this grim history has been literally unearthed. Beginning in 2021, First Nations using ground-penetrating radar began detecting what are believed to be thousands of potential unmarked graves on the grounds of former schools. While these sites require further forensic investigation and few excavations have occurred as of mid-2025, the findings corroborate the survivors' decades-old stories of children who went to school and simply vanished. For over a century, the Church acted as the willing agent of the state's devastating policy, using the cross as a cudgel to shatter families, destroy cultures, and erase identities. The persecution of dissenters is a recurring theme. Long before the schools of Canada, another group of Christians faced extermination for the simple crime of wanting to read the Bible for themselves. Long before Martin Luther, a reform movement was already sweeping across Europe, and the Church was trying to extinguish it with fire and sword. This is the story of the Waldensians, one of the earliest and most brutally persecuted proto-Protestant movements. It started around 1173 with a wealthy merchant from Lyon, France, named Peter Waldo. After a spiritual crisis, he gave away his possessions and began to preach a message of poverty and simplicity, commissioning a translation of the New Testament into the local language so that ordinary people could read it. His followers, known as the Poor of Lyon, traveled as itinerant preachers. At first, they wanted to reform the church from within, but the church hierarchy was threatened by their use of a non-Latin Bible and their practice of allowing lay people, including women, to preach. This challenged the church's monopoly on scripture and authority. In 1184, the Waldensians were excommunicated and branded heretics. This decree unleashed centuries of relentless persecution. The Waldensians were hunted by the Inquisition and forced to flee into remote alpine valleys in France and Italy. Their crimes included rejecting the veneration of saints and, most damningly, reading the Bible in their own language. The persecutions were horrific. In 1211, over 80 Waldensians were burned at the stake. One of the most infamous episodes was the massacre of Merindal in 1545. After the Waldensians aligned themselves with the Protestant Reformation, King Francis I of France ordered them punished. Royal troops descended on their villages, slaughtering an estimated 3,000 people and devastating 22 villages. For centuries, they endured massacres, forced conversions, and oppression. Their children were sometimes kidnapped to be raised Catholic, and yet they persevered. The Waldensians are a stark and bloody example of the Church's willingness to use extreme violence, not against an external enemy, but to crush internal dissent and maintain absolute control over scripture, doctrine, and power. We have journeyed through some of the darkest chapters of institutional history. We've stood in the ashes of Bessiers, where thousands of Christians were slaughtered by other Christians. We've witnessed the murder of Hypatia, a scholar killed by a mob in a city being violently reshaped by religious dogma. We've looked into the oppressive Laundries of Ireland, where the church and state enslaved thousands of women. We've walked the quiet grounds of Canada's residential schools, where the church was an agent of cultural genocide. And we've hidden with the Waldensians, a people hunted for centuries for daring to read the Bible themselves. These 5 truths aren't just isolated events. They reveal a disturbing pattern, faith being used as a justification for power, control, and violence. They show what happens when an institution places its own authority and ambitions above the core principles of compassion and humanity that it claims to represent. This is not an attack on individual faith, nor is it meant to erase the countless acts of good done by people of faith. It is, however, an unflinching look at the institutional shadow of the church. A shadow filled with victims whose stories were deliberately silenced, buried, and denied. To ignore this history is to accept a sanitized version of the past. To confront it is to understand how power works, how narratives are built, and how easily ideals can be corrupted. The past can't be changed, but it can be known. And by knowing it, we arm ourselves against the repetition of its darkest moments. The most dangerous truth is the one that stays hidden. If this journey into the hidden corners of history has opened your eyes, make sure you subscribe and click the notification bell. The powerful rely on our ignorance. Let's not give it to them. We want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on these events? Do you know of other hidden histories that need to be brought into the light? Let us know in the comments below. Knowledge is our best weapon against the darkness.